Imagine stepping into a smoky Texas roadhouse sometime in the 1950s. The air is thick with the scent of fried food and motor oil. A handful of rugged locals huddle around a jukebox, and just beyond them stands a young performer in front of a mic, his guitar at the ready. Except he's not your typical country crooner. His demeanor is shy, his demeanor reserved, yet the moment he opens his mouth, the entire room hushes. That voice, its depth, range, and startling vulnerability transfix every single person in the joint. They'll be talking about that performance for days, maybe for years. Eventually, the world would come to know and love that haunting voice, attached to a name that would make rock and roll history, Roy Orbison. Born on April 23, 1936, in Vernon, Texas, Roy Kelton. Orbison arrived as the middle child of 3 sons in a working-class family. His father, Orbie Lee, was an oil field worker who often struggled to find steady gigs, especially after the economic turmoil of the Great Depression. His mother, Nadine, painted, wrote poetry, and fostered a certain creativity in her children. Some genealogists trace the Orbison family line all the way back to 18th century Ireland, but Roy was every bit the product of hardscrabble Texas. Big skies, dusty streets, and folks who found relief in music, especially on those scorching summer nights. Early childhood for Roy was marked by a few distinct traits that would follow him his entire life. Before he hit first grade, Roy was already wearing thick prescription glasses due to poor eyesight. In the years to come, those big frames would become as much of a signature as his rich vocal tone. He got his first guitar at age 6 thanks to his father. By 7, the instrument had already become a fixture in Roy's daily routine. He often said that from the minute he learned his first chord, he knew music would be his life. The influences swirling around him were as diverse as the Fort Worth and West Texas neighborhoods he inhabited: country, western swing, gospel, the occasional big band tune floating in from someone's radio. Roy's father introduced him to the singing sessions popular in wartime Fort Worth, where newly enlisted soldiers would gather to belt out standards before heading off to fight in World War II. The intensity and emotion of those gatherings left a deep mark on Roy. Singing, to him, was always bound up in a sense of longing, desperation, and the possibility of saying goodbye. When the Orbisons moved to Wink, Texas, Roy was just 10, and the environment couldn't have been more different. Wink was a small oil patch town, mostly known for grease, grit, and football. Roy didn't fit into the athletic scene, so he channeled his energy into music. He was the kid on the school playground playing guitar while everyone else tossed around a ball. Self-conscious about his nearly white hair, he soon began dyeing it black. That midnight shade would later become part of his iconic aesthetic. If Wink was rough and tumble, Roy was subdued and polite. He rarely partied, rarely got into trouble, but the desert solitude and those lonesome highways around Wink seeped into his spirit, and before long, into the songs he would write. His first band, assembled around 1949, was called the Wink Westerners. They played local country and western swing standards at tiny honky-tonks and even got a weekly slot on the radio station KERB in Kermit, Texas. Roy was only about 13 then, but he was already a seasoned performer in some ways, thanks to earlier stints on local radio shows in Fort Worth. His bandmates recall that from the moment Roy began singing, something remarkable happened in the room. He might have been shy, but that voice was anything but timid. Roy once realized he could earn $400, real money, especially for a teenager, just by playing music at a single gig. That's when the light bulb switched on. Maybe he could make a living from this. By 15, Roy had decided the guitar would be his accompanist, not his main attraction. His singing, he believed, was the star. He and the Wink Westerners entered a talent contest in Midland, Texas. They won, and for a short time they got a 30-minute slot on a local TV show. Even so, Roy was a cautious dreamer. After high school, he enrolled at North Texas State College in Denton, planning to study geology just in case music didn't pan out, and he needed to work the oil fields. But geology bored him to tears. Music was all that really mattered. He soon met some fellow students who shared his passion for the new, hip sounds sweeping the South. Rockabilly was on the rise. A few of Roy's friends wrote a catchy track called Ooby Dooby, and Roy couldn't get the tune out of his head. Meanwhile, Roy watched from afar as another Denton classmate, Pat Boone, signed a record deal and rocketed to national fame. That was enough to galvanize him. Roy dropped out of North Texas State College and reformed his band, calling them the Teen Kings. Now the style shifted from country and western to an emerging brand of rock and roll. Ooby Dooby became the Teen Kings' first recording, initially released on a tiny local label called Jewel. But Roy had bigger ambitions. Somehow he wanted this song to get noticed by a real record company with real distribution muscle. After a series of twists, some involving a conflict with Jewel, a turned-down demo at Columbia, and others, Roy came to the attention of Sam Phillips at Sun Records. Legend has it that Johnny Cash personally advised Roy to bring Ooby Dooby to Phillips, although the exact details are disputed. However it happened, Sam Phillips heard the potential in Roy's voice and the Teen Kings' rockabilly bounce. In spring 1956, they re-recorded Ooby Dooby at the famed Sun Studio in Memphis. Soon, it was out on Sun Records, climbing the charts and selling 200,000 copies. A solid number for a rockabilly newcomer. Roy splurged on a brand new purple Cadillac and a diamond ring when those royalty checks came rolling in. Life seemed sweet, but tensions flared. Roy wanted to pursue emotional ballads, the kind of music that truly spoke to his soul, while Sam Phillips had a vision of making Roy the next Elvis Presley. The label wanted rockabilly. Roy wanted heartbreak stories. Artistic clashes aside, the Teen Kings soon dissolved in 1956. Roy was broke, forced to float around for a while, couch surfing, playing small gigs on tours with guys like Johnny Cash, Carl Perkins, and others. He got a taste of rockabilly road life, late-night drives, cheap hotels, half-empty halls. After months of frustration, Roy concluded that just maybe stardom wasn't going to happen at Sun Records. He did, however, manage to write a ballad called Claudette, named after his teenage sweetheart. In 1957, Roy and Claudette got married. The Everly Brothers recorded Claudette in 1958 as a B-side to All I Have to Do Is Dream, which rose into the top 40. The royalties helped Roy and Claudette buy a pink Cadillac, but they spent beyond their means, ending up back home in Wink, living with Roy's parents for a while. That was life for Roy Orbison in 1958, a guy with promise who'd had a minor rockabilly hit but couldn't quite find his place in an evolving music scene. Yet Roy wasn't done. He found a gig at Acuff Rose Music, a songwriting firm in Nashville. He wrote demos by day, pitching songs to established singers. He was in awe of the city's legendary producers, session musicians and music publishing giants. That's where he struck up a partnership with the songwriter Joe Melson. Together they sent out demos to various labels. Then came a lucky break. The up-and-coming Monument Records, run by Fred Foster, heard something special in Roy's demos. In 1959, Roy got to walk into RCA Victor's studio in Nashville to cut some tracks, including Uptown. It didn't blow the roof off the charts, but it had a distinctive polish, merging orchestral touches with a more pop-friendly vibe. It hinted at something bigger and bolder, something that might just change Roy's fortunes. And then it happened, Only the Lonely. Recorded in 1960, the song gave Roy a chance to belt a high falsetto note with spine-chilling vulnerability. Bill Porter, the sound engineer, captured Roy's voice in a fresh way, placing it front and center, weaving gentle strings behind him. Suddenly, Roy's heartbreak ballad soared to number 2 on the Billboard Hot 100, hitting number 1 in the UK and Australia. Everything changed. The shy kid from Wink found himself on tour after tour. Radio DJs played Only the Lonely in heavy rotation. Elvis Presley reportedly bought a box of the single to give to friends. Roy's voice, with its remarkable range and haunting clarity, was finally unleashed to the world. Over the next few years, Roy Orbison would rack up an astonishing run of hits that now define a golden era of early 1960s pop. Blue Angel, I'm Hurtin', Running Scared, Crying. Each new record built upon Roy's dramatic style. He introduced powerful crescendos, extended notes beyond typical pop structures, and layered on orchestral flourishes. Running Scared, in particular, concluded with Roy hitting a high note that stunned the session musicians so badly that they temporarily stopped playing. When they realized he'd nailed it, they had to re-record the final bars. That intensity became a Roy Orbison hallmark, a man who looked calm, hair dyed black, thick prescription glasses, often wearing dark suits, but who unleashed unstoppable emotional force whenever he sang. Critics and fans alike began to see Roy as a new kind of rock star, quite different from Elvis or Chuck Berry. There was no swagger, no extroverted showmanship. Instead, Roy stood stock still, arms at his sides, letting his voice carry the entire performance. Audiences found it mesmerizing. As the British invasion dawned in the early 1960s, Roy's quiet persona and uniquely dramatic ballads were bridging an unexpected gap. When he first visited the UK in 1963, he found out that the rising Beatles phenomenon had overshadowed him in some respects, but Roy famously insisted on going on stage ahead of the Beatles, only to deliver 14 encores. The Beatles then, at the cusp of global mania, were floored. They had grown up admiring him, and here he was setting the stage on fire in their own backyard. During that tour, Roy developed a bond with George Harrison. Roy recognized something special in Harrison, and years later they'd collaborate in the most unexpected ways. In the meantime, Roy kept topping the charts in Dreams, Mean Woman Blues, Blue Bayou, and especially Oh Pretty Woman, which exploded in 1964. Co-written with Bill Dees, Oh Pretty Woman featured one of the most iconic guitar riffs in rock history. It sold millions of copies worldwide and stands among the most recognizable hits of the era. With that single, Roy achieved a second wave of massive success, proving he could hold his own amidst the Beatles, Rolling Stones, and the entire British invasion. Behind the scenes, Roy's personal life was a tangle of triumphs and tragedies. He married Claudette when she was still a teenager, and they had 3 children together. But the pressures of constant touring, coupled with the temptations of life on the road and complicated feelings on both sides, led to heartbreak. Their relationship frayed. Claudette briefly had an affair. Roy had his own indiscretions. They divorced in 1965, then reconciled and remarried a year later, only for tragedy to strike soon after. In 1966, while riding motorcycles together near Nashville, Claudette was hit by a pickup truck and killed almost instantly. She was just 25. Devastated, Roy pressed on. He turned to his music as both a refuge and a lifeline. MGM Records signed him to what seemed like a lucrative deal, with the promise of expanding his career into movies and television, just like Elvis. Roy starred in a Western-themed film comedy called The Fastest Guitar Alive, wielding a guitar-turned-rifle. The movie flopped, and so did his subsequent albums at MGM, which lacked the magic synergy of his work at Monument with Fred Foster and Bill Porter. As the late 60s morphed into the early 70s, the rock scene changed drastically. Psychedelic bands, heavy blues rock, and new wave artists rose to prominence, leaving Roy's lush orchestral ballads behind. He found himself with fewer hits, lower attendance at concerts, and a sense that the world had moved on. Yet heartbreak hadn't finished with Roy Orbison. In 1968, his house in Hendersonville, Tennessee, burned to the ground while he was on tour in England. 2 of his sons perished in the fire, compounding the immeasurable grief he'd already endured. For a time, Roy was paralyzed by sorrow, unable to write, unsure if the world still had a place for his music. He'd grown up in an era of doo-wop, rockabilly, and country, and now the airwaves were crammed with Led Zeppelin, Jimi Hendrix, and others who seemed galaxies away from Roy's brand of emotional pop. During his travels, Roy met a teenage German fan named Barbara. Smitten by her kindness and devotion, she was there at multiple shows. He eventually married her in 1969. Roy was in his early 30s. Barbara was either 17, 18, or 19, accounts vary. And though it raised eyebrows, she became his anchor, and they remained together for the rest of Roy's life. They had 2 sons together, Roy Kelton Jr. and Alexander. Roy's surviving son from Claudette Wesley was raised by Roy's parents. Through the 1970s, Roy continued to record, hoping for a hit that would reignite his career. 1 or 2 singles did okay overseas, particularly Penny Arcade in Australia. But in the United States, he struggled to break back into mainstream consciousness. Then, in 1977, after years of punishing tours and personal turmoil, Roy's health took a serious nosedive. He had open heart surgery in 1978. A heavy smoker since he was a teenager, Roy tried to cut back but never managed to fully quit. Touring was still a grind, playing mostly oldie circuits and smaller venues. His name didn't carry the same commercial weight it once had, yet longtime fans adored him. Then a glimmer of hope emerged in the early 1980s. Linda Ronstadt's cover of Blue Bayou soared on the charts, reintroducing the public to Roy's classic hit. Don McLean's version of Crying topped charts internationally, and Bruce Springsteen made no secret of his adoration for Roy, sometimes ending his own concerts with Orbison numbers. A genuine renaissance, however, arrived in 1986 and 1987. David Lynch used In Dreams in the now infamous film Blue Velvet, starring Dennis Hopper as the psychotic Frank Booth. The surreal way Lynch wove Roy's dreamy ballad into the movie rekindled interest in Roy's music among younger, alternative audiences. Suddenly, Roy wasn't just an oldies performer. He was a hip icon of mysterious heartbreak. He also earned renewed respect in the industry, culminating in his induction into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 1987. Bruce Springsteen gave the induction speech, admitting that as a young musician, he desperately wanted to sing like Roy. This public accolade validated Roy in a way no chart position could. That same year, Roy staged a once-in-a-lifetime concert in Los Angeles at the Coconut Grove. The show, filmed in black and white, featured a breathtaking all-star lineup: Springsteen, Elvis Costello, Tom Waits, Bonnie Raitt, K.D. Lang, Jennifer Warnes, T-Bone Burnett, and more, all backing Roy. Called Roy Orbison and Friends, a black and white night, the special captured Roy at his best, performing classics like Only the Lonely and Oh Pretty Woman, with an energy few expected from a man who'd been all but invisible in the mainstream for nearly 2 decades. The broadcast became a sensation and a prized VHS, reminding people that once upon a time, Roy Orbison had all but defined the power ballad. The final piece of Roy's comeback arrived in 1988 with an unlikely project: The Traveling Wilburys. One afternoon, Roy was hanging out with George Harrison, whom he'd known since the Beatles days, and producer Jeff Lynne, who had just finished Harrison's Cloud 9 album. Bob Dylan hopped on board, offering them use of his home studio. Tom Petty joined after a chance stop to pick up George's guitar from Petty's house. The synergy was immediate, and from this jam session emerged the Wilburys, 5 icons of popular music inventing a band persona. Roy took the stage name Lefty Wilbury, a nod to his favorite country singer Lefty Frizzell. Their album Traveling Wilburys Volume 1 was a smash hit, propelled by witty songwriting and the pure delight of these legendary figures creating music together. Roy's presence, a voice that soared above the rest, was singled out by critics as a highlight, especially on tracks like Not Alone Anymore. The Wilburys gave Roy a taste of top-tier stardom one more time. The surge of creative energy carried him to record a new solo album. Mystery Girl, produced largely by Lynne, was shaping up to be Roy's triumphant reintroduction. Tom Petty and others contributed songs. Elvis Costello offered a track. Sessions took place in L.A., Roy's new base since moving from Nashville. He was down in weight, charged with adrenaline, and brimming with optimism. In the Wilburys' Handle with Care video, Roy looked relaxed, wise, and finally in step with his own legend. 1 month later, in November 1988, Mystery Girl was done. Roy gave a few interviews, performed at a show in Boston, and was scheduled for more traveling. But the swirl of excitement was laced with concern. Close friends noticed Roy battling chest pains, and he seemed exhausted. On December 4th, he played what would be his final concert at the Front Row Theater in Highland Heights, Ohio. 2 days later, at his mother's home in Hendersonville, Tennessee, Roy was discovered collapsed in the bathroom. He died of a heart attack at age 52. The music world reeled. Just when Roy Orbison was on the verge of a second major act, fate took him away. At the memorial, fans, family, and celebrities gathered to celebrate the life of a man who'd seemed both timeless and ephemeral. The tributes poured in, praising Roy's operatic range, his gentle persona, and the deep pathos in his songs. Meanwhile, Mystery Girl, released posthumously in January 1989, soared to Roy's highest album sales ever. The single You Got It was a top 10 hit on both sides of the Atlantic, echoing with heartbreak and triumph. The traveling Wilburys, left reeling by Roy's absence, shot a music video for End of the Line, in which Roy's guitar rocked gently in a chair, a poignant visual farewell. After Roy's death, the world seemed to rediscover him all over again, as though hearing crying or only the lonely for the first time. His estate, initially managed by his wife Barbara until her passing in 2011, continued to release special albums and ensure Roy's legacy. A 1992 album called King of Hearts collected various recordings from his final years, giving fans more glimpses of Roy's latter-day voice. Roy's 3 surviving sons also got involved in preserving their father's remarkable story, reissuing classics and unveiling archival demos. More tributes followed. Linda Ronstadt's earlier cover of Blue Bayou remained a radio staple. Van Halen's version of Oh Pretty Woman introduced Roy to the 80s rock crowd, and a new generation discovered him via cameo appearances in movies like Lynch's Blue Velvet or the documentary concerts that captured his captivating stage presence. If you were to close your eyes and imagine Roy Orbison on stage, you'd see a trim figure in dark clothing, rooted to one spot, eyes shielded by thick tinted lenses, hands clasping the microphone as if it were his only lifeline. Then the music would begin, some gentle guitar chords, maybe a bit of strings, and that voice would rise, hushed at first, then building and building until it hit an emotional apex no one else could reach. That was the inimitable Roy Orbison. And that is why Decades after his passing, we still listen to him. We still marvel at his recordings, and we still remember him. Longing and heartbreak never sounded so captivating and probably never will again.